You know, I'm an old geezer. I mean, I'm 77. You know, what are the kids doing? I don't know.
Well, he does know quite a lot, as it turns out. After all, he did discover one of the biggest rock bands of the 20th and 21st century. And a lot of other things along the way, as you're going to find out. I'm Stephen Coates. This is the Bureau of Lost Culture, dedicated to countercultural, rare, half-forgotten, half-remembered stories. And my guest today, well, he was there. He was managing the counterculture in some way. He was instrumental in the setting up of the Free School in Notting Hill, which led to International Times, one of the most important of the independent underground press newspapers. He also, apart from that band that I mentioned earlier, he helped the careers of many other people you've heard of. Marc Bolan, Ian Drury, The Clash, Billy Bragg, Roy Harper, and that band, of course, the Pink Floyd. He's Peter Jenner, one half of the management company Black Hill that discovered the Floyd, and then later on with Sincere Management with his daughter Mushi. And thanks, Mushi, for setting up this conversation with Pete. We appreciate it. So, here we go. He's irascible, charming, funny, unsentimental about the counterculture, I would say. Very honest and very modest, considering what he's done. He is Pete Jenner. Hello, Pete.
Hello, Stephen. How are you?
Well, I'm great, and thank you for coming to the Bureau of Lost Culture. So, Pete, I've given a bit of an intro then, but who are you?
Oh, for Christ's sake. Have that talk. Yeah. Oh, well, I'm just an old waffler.
Well, tell us, waffle on. Tell us about how you came to be involved in the 60s in the counterculture, because you had a bit of a political background, and I think you're a Londoner, right? So how did you get there?
Yeah. So the 60s was where my sort of, as it were, involvement in all this sort of stuff started. I was born in 43, so I grew up in the 50s, and my parents were political. My grandfather was an MP. My father was a vicar, but was also very involved in campaigns of one sort and another. He was involved in sort of anti-nuclear stuff and so on. He was also involved in various campaigns as a vicar about people who were being hung and things like that, and trying to stop them being hung. And he was always in trouble with the diocese, you know. Campaigning is, as it were, in the family. So I guess I come from a family of troublemakers.
Right. So politics is in the blood. The other thing which is in your blood is music. So how did you evolve into what you were to become later? You know, when did you really start to get into music?
Well, I started mixing with people and getting to know people. And I mean, one of the things which happens when you get to university is you don't really know anyone. So you become involved in groups, because that way you get to know people. And one of the things I became involved with was the sort of Labour group, and then also music people. There was a good music scene going on in Cambridge. And so I'd been a music fan, so I would hang out looking at music and hang out with musicians and hanging out with politicians. So in a sense, I suppose politics and music have always been pretty crucial in...
Right, but when you were at Cambridge, you were studying economics, did very well, got a first-class degree from Cambridge, so pretty brainy, right? Went to work at London School of Economics, pretty brainy, so you weren't planning to be a music manager. What was your vision for your life then?
I suppose I was sort of moving towards being a government expert on social welfare issues in a sort of broader sense. You know, this was late Wilson time, and so I was involved with those sorts of issues as an academic.
And there's quite a few people like that around at the time, right? I mean, you said in your interview with Jonathan Green for Days in the Life all those years ago, you said, I think that the reason that Oxford and Cambridge people, I assume you mean academic students and musicians and stuff, had such an influence in the early underground is because we'd been given the works, baby boomers, I guess. We'd scored somehow through a combination of our parents and our abilities. We've been given the best of what traditional Britain had to offer. and it wasn't very impressive. So I guess there was sounds like somewhat of a class thing going on, was there?
Yeah, well, I think that we didn't we weren't upper class in that sense. Our families were the sort of middle class aggro people. So one of my best friends, Sam Hutt, his father was involved with running the Morning Star.
Right, so been to Cambridge, come to London, working at the LSE, teaching, you're an academic. It does sound like you're one of those people from that particular class who's, bound for power, going to go and work in the government.
Well, I wasn't actually moving towards working in government. I was moving towards working on government issues and sort of, telling the government what they should do, rather than actually being the government doing it.
Are you one of those people who likes telling people what to do?
I guess I must be, because I was doing that, and then I end up being a manager where you tell people what to do. So I guess and you should also talk to Mushy about that. I guess I'm a bossy boots, and I have all the answers, but I'm also have about a humility about that. I do know that I don't know all the answers.
But you make this big career vocational swerve from future government advisor, academic, political person to, member of the Counterculture and music manager. So let's get into that. What made that, what were the roots of that change?
I was always a music fan. I was a music fan before I was interested in politics. As a kid, my brother and myself, we spent all our money, going to gigs and things and hanging out at the Gaumont State Kilburn, trying to get the autographs of the Duke Ellington Orchestra and things like that. And, when I was sort of about 17, I'd gone to America. I went to America. My father sent me to America, and we managed to, Andrew King and myself and so on, we wandered around listening to music and seeing people play in Chicago, walking across the south side of Chicago late at night, 3 sort of 16, 17-year-olds. Madness. Still a rough area, but there we go. We would go there. So I had some great experiences, and then we traveled around in America, and we went to Mexico. So I sort of wandered around.
Yeah, so fast forward through to the early 60s, that wandering has brought you to London, living in Covent Garden, sharing a flat with Eric Clapton, some guy who could play guitar a bit. Was there a sense then in London of this burgeoning counterculture, the underground scene coming, and did you feel like, oh, I want to be part of that or something?
Perhaps. But I think that what one thought one was doing, one was in there grooving and being groovy, and the happening scene. So whatever was happening, one wanted to be involved in it, and sort of one became involved with it. To me, what else should I do? Am I going to be, am I going to go be a school teacher, or am I going to be groovy? So of course I decided to be groovy.
Well, okay, what did being groovy look like? How did you paint us a picture of how you look, Pete?
Oh, I had long hair, and I had a real shitty beard. Oh, I had a little bowl cut and a suit. I've forgotten that completely. Mushy. I'll take Mushy's word for that.
When you first started with the Floyd, you were a little fully suit teacher, respectable looking young man.
Oh, yes. Did you hear all that? Mushy was saying I was a respectable looking young man when I was a teacher. Yes.
And of course, we should mention another groover, Andrew King, your lifelong friend and business associate, co-manager later on. You guys were buddies, so you were kind of doing much of this stuff in parallel, right?
He was also another vicar's son, and we spent time together. His father was a vicar out in the country, and I was in London. We were going to school in London. So we lived with each other for some time. He was stuck with my family for some time.
Right, and you ended up discovering the Floyd together. So you're at LSE, you're quite a political animal, political background, you're a massive music head at the same time. And then you make this big career swerve. This is what you said to Jonathan Green about that discovery and that thing which kind of seemed to kick off this big change in your life. While I was marking some exam papers at the LSE, I needed a break. So I went over to the Marquee, where there was a gig. It was a private gig, and the band playing was called the Pink Floyd Sound. There were various people sliming around in jelly, and colour was being thrown all over them. And I saw the band and I thought, they'll do. That sounds fun and quite simple.
Yes. Well, first of all, there was a sort of, it was a happening. I don't know if that was actually the word they used. I think it might have been. It was a happening. So when I arrived, and there was some sort of naked girls, or apparently naked girls, slithering around on the floor of the Marquee, in sort of coloured jelly, and then there was this band playing, because the Marquee was a big sort of music club, but it was a Sunday, so it wasn't the normal special event. And it was Bernard Stallman, and he was from New York, and it was also, as it were, the international sort of avant-garde hippie world, as it were. I saw the band, went to see the band, and what got me was the fact that I didn't know where the noise was coming from. In other words, I could tell that was the drums, there was the bass, there was someone singing, but then there was some other stuff going on. And I couldn't distinguish between, with my ears, whether it was from the keyboard player or whether it was from the guitar player. And that intrigued me. So that's why I started wandering around looking at who was playing what, because there was lots of repeats going on. So that Syd was playing with a Benson Echarec, which was an early echo machine, a sort of repeat machine. And then Rick was playing with lots of, sustained chords. So that there was a lot of swirling around of things. And then through that, Roger and Nick would be sort of keeping a sort of a beat going, So it was intriguing. To me, it was intriguing. It was avant-garde. It was a different. It wasn't playing the blues. I mean, that's the other thing. All the bands then were blues bands, and it wasn't just a blues band. So obviously the blues influence, but it wasn't a blues band. And it wasn't a guitar virtuoso band, because Syd wasn't a guitar virtuoso. So it wasn't like an Eric Clapton, or it wasn't a sort of, Pete Green or anything like that. It wasn't a virtuoso thing. Nor was there a sort of leader like a John Mayall. So it was a very sort of interesting combination of people, and it wasn't what most of the sort of the standard bands you'd see of us, in London, would not be like that. They were different. And that's what I like. They were different.
Right, and different enough so that you decided that you wanted to manage them.
I think so, more or less. Yes, I mean, we went out and found them. Well, I mean, essentially it was saying, you're a band, I'd like to be a manager and I'd like to manage you. What do you think? It was as pretty well as simple as that. And I think they thought, well, we don't have a manager. Neither of us really knew what a manager did. But there was an assumption that bands had managers, and that I think that managers thought that they told the band what to do, and the band thought that managers paid for everything.
That's right, isn't it?
So there was that was, why'd you have a manager? Well, because he'll buy you equipment. So then we bought them equipment, and so on. There was this sort of, on both sides, and a huge ignorance about what the hell we were doing. I mean, except somewhere in there were some people playing music, and there were some people trying to generate some economic value around it, get paid, because, we were all young and we needed to start getting paid. We couldn't just live off our parents, though some of us did to some extent.
How did you know what it meant to be a music manager then at the time?
Oh, that was a classic story. At a party at Hoppy's, I was there and the Floyd were there, and the soft machine were there at the party. And I went to one of them and I said, "Hi, I'm Pete Jenner, and I'm managing the Pink Floyd." "Oh, yeah. "And you're in the soft machine?" Yeah. Because one of the soft machine lived above my flat in just off Elgin Avenue. And I said, "Well, as a matter of curiosity, what does a manager do?" And he gave an answer, which I still think is one of the greatest answers. It was, "Ask Henry." Ask Henry. Yes, Henry's our manager. And if someone asks us about something, we say, "Ask Henry."
That's it, right?
Great definition of what a manager does. He's ask Henry. I was Henry, and so therefore I would be asked what to do. So ask Henry.
I wonder where Henry is. Hope he's out there still. We should ask him. So you mentioned Hoppy then, John Hopkins, a big, pivotal figure in that whole underground West London countercultural scene. So you're managing the Floyd, but you're also getting deeper into that whole scene. And Hoppy, of course, and Barry Miles, old friend of ours, he involved in the foundation of International Times, the Underground's main newspaper, and then the Free School. Tell us about the London Free School.
It was a young posh boy's attempt to relate to the illuminate the working classes.
How so?
It was a really 19th century, if you want to think about it. It was very sort of traditional. Now, there was our public school boys. We would all gone to Oxford or Cambridge, we were all posh boys, really. And we were all young. And then we would sort of go round to sort of Notting Hill in the Paris Terrace and all around there by the Tabernacle, all around that area. And it was very impoverished. There was a big problem with landlords, what was his name? The Rackman, and he was involved. And one of the people who did his work for him was Michael Abdul Malik, Michael X, and he was one of Rackman's men. And so it was that weird combination that we posh kids were going to help sort out the problems of the poor, the poor people living in their slums, because they were slummed. Rackman was pretty ropey. So that's where we started the idea of the London Free School, because we would teach these poor, ignorant, working class people about pass on our knowledge from.
Well, was there what was the curriculum? What did the London Free School actually do?
We talked more about what we were going to do than actually doing it. Sort of sitting around talking about what we'd do, and not very much of actually doing anything. But there were some things. It was like the International Times, and it was it was also a focus for people to meet and to change the atmosphere of London in some ways, which it did, because we saw ourselves in a way as a community. But we were, as it were, also very aware of the fact that we were the golden generation. We'd had it very, we benefited from the welfare state big time, and we'd all gone to, So there was an awareness of a sort of social obligation.
Yeah, and that social obligation, you've said you kind of inherited that as part of your kind of family's DNA. And of course, despite your modesty about the London Free School, lots of great things did come out of it. International Times, obviously, the great underground newspaper, but also all those events at the Tabernacle, which I think it became a kind of focus, a social focus for various psychedelic happenings and stuff with the Floyd and with others.
Certainly I did have a lot to do with the church hall, because we needed a place where we could put on events. And there in the middle of Paris Terrace, or around in Paris Square, there was a church. I thought, well, okay, if there's a church hall, I know from my father being a vicar, they don't, they sit there and they don't make much money. You have the odd whist drive. So they would like to make some money. And it's also a place where, in some senses, the reason for having a church hall is so the community can meet have a place where the community can meet. They can have. So in a sense, I saw the possibility that the church hall could be a place that we could, as it were, we could be the community which uses it. And, the vicar was quite cool about it, and we paid him his £3 or whatever it was to rent the building. We were part of the community, I guess, was his view.
And the gigs that you were doing there, those early gigs with Pink Floyd, they became quite epochal in some way, didn't it? Set the scene, with not just the band, but with a whole Technicolor light show.
Hoppy had this connection with these people who did light shows, so we were able to put them up in the balcony in the church hall, and they were able to project things while people played. So that whole mixture of sound lights, which became a key part of the early Pink Floyd things, it was a sound light experience. that was what was interesting about what we did, I guess, was that it wasn't just about music, and it was a sort of very open. So when we started doing things in Tottenham Court Road down in the Barney Club, you know, there would be poems and poets and light projections and people playing music, and it was a very sort of open world, you know, and it was very culturally open. It was a centre for all those sort of alternative culture.
Right, so you started off in the Tabernacle with that stuff, developing it in Ladbroke Grove, West London, and then moves over to Central London, that Blarney Club, the Irish club that you mentioned, that became UFO, the swinging 60s psychedelic centre, and you had a hand in setting all that up, right?
Yeah, I mean, Joe Boyd had a lot to do with it, and Harper found it. What it was an Irish club. It was a bar underneath it was a dance hall, and it was a dance hall underneath a cinema. What was good, what made it important was that it had a bar, and the bar couldn't work on Sundays. Bars weren't open on Sundays back then. So it was, as it were, an empty space on a Sunday, because Sundays were very closed up back then. You know, pubs weren't open on Sundays, or cinemas often wouldn't be open on Sundays. There'd be a band, often the Floyd, but sometimes some other things. There'd be bands. There would be poets reading poetry in a corner when there wasn't the band going on. There would be some projections. There would be some people doing some, quote, dance to the music, you know, so there was some pretty ropey dancing going on, but all very amateur and all very in the spirit. And most importantly, it was fashionable. It became instantly fashionable. It got a coverage in the Melody Maker, which was the big paper at the time. And so it became very popular very quickly. You know, it was pretty groovy.
It sounded pretty groovy. We had Jenny Fabian, the author of the book Groupie, in here last year. And of course, a lot of that book, you know, takes place in the scene, as she calls it, in central London, and UFO is very much part of that. And she describes wonderfully nights down there. But she also says something which is quite interesting, which is that whole scene, which I suppose has become a bit mythologized, possibly over-mythologized, you know, she says about it, it was very small. You know, it was just a few hundred people, rather than, you know, some big earth-quaking movement.
Yes, it was a very small group of people. I mean, the Blarney Club, which was UFO, I mean, if you actually rammed everybody in, if it was a really packed night, you might have had 200 or 300 people there. Mm-hmm. That would have been very busy. But they were small gigs, because we all knew it, you know, you knew each other. It was a sort of, so it was quite, a lot of people who knew people were there. And so you would go there and maybe meet more people. It was very social.
And that small social group, despite its size then, did you have a sense that it was the beginning of something, that something was going on, that, you know, you could change the world in that kind of optimistic, utopian 60s way? That this countercultural scene was going to bring about some lasting change? There
was that perception, I think, that somehow or another we were changing the world and changing society. And that was all also in the context, again, I keep going back to Wilson government, that post-war government in the 50s was very important. That Labour government, you know, was very significant.
So you're getting quite busy. You know, you've got the UFO going on, you've got London Free School, all that other stuff in Ladbroke Grove, and of course, you know, you're managing the Pink Floyd, who are getting busier and busier and busier. And so you guys, I guess, had to get serious, right?
When I sort of became a professional manager with Andrew and I sort of set up Blackhill, which was set up in a shop front in Alexander Street with his now wife and her girlfriend. They had a studio. They were artists, art studio, and they were doing art. And they came out of art school from Cambridge Art School. And I think it's interesting, that Cambridge thing, because Syd was from Cambridge. And so there's quite a sort of Cambridge connection, but I don't think they particularly knew each other, though. You know, Andrews, Wendy, and the Floyd people. But there was a lot of it was coming out of Cambridge in the Cambridge Art School.
What year was this then?
67, 69. They sound sort of a bit familiar.
And then what made the big sort of jump up for Pink Floyd? Because from this underground band playing these little gigs to, you know, big record deals and much bigger gigs and starting to take off and touring all over the place, including going abroad. And were the people helping you with that?
Well, yes, the very key important person was Brian Morrison. And that was very key. They were, as it were, our guides to perfect the professional music business. Because, I mean, we were doing just things in the church hall were strictly amateur, really, you know. And it was then through the connection with Brian Morrison and his operation that the Floyd were able to get out and do gigs and find gigs. I mean, I didn't know where to find a gig. I mean, I could, you know, we were capable of putting together a gig in a place where it wasn't normally a gig, i.e. a church hall or something, but we weren't in the music sort of channels. And so people like Brian Morrison were very important in advising, well, where, you know, we should have a record deal, shouldn't we? Yes. Well, who should we go to? Where should we go to? There are these record companies. What record company should we go to? And he said, go to the biggest company in the country. So we went to an EMI. It was at that stage. It was EMI was the biggest record company, because most of the other record companies were either very small, like relatively small, like Pi, or else they were the early manifestations of offices for American labels. That was beginning to start, but they weren't big at their own time. At that time, they were small operations, and there were Philips had an operation, and so there were various people various companies who'd sussed that something was happening in London. So there were these other operations coming into London. The enemy was seen as a bit naff. The enemy was pop. Interestingly, it completely turned. The enemy was seen as pop, and the Melody Maker came more from jazz. It was a jazz magazine. Pop was uncool and jazz was cool. And it's interesting how that completely turned around, you know.
What was it you think that made EMI go for Pink Floyd? Because, you know, huge record company, small underground band. What kicked it all off?
We started in the autumn, and by Christmas we had the central spread in the Melody Maker, which was the big music paper, and it was like this was the sound of the next year. So that there was an awareness and so I think that's how EMI realized that there was something going on with all this underground stuff. And if you're interested in the underground, it was the Pink Floyd or the Soft Machine, and the Pink Floyd were definitely the bigger dogs.
What did that feel like? You just now signed to the biggest record label in the UK, one of the bigger ones in the world. Must have been exciting.
Well, it was just sort of like, oh, that's great, isn't it? They gave us an advance. Fantastic. We were able to buy some equipment, you know, and you know, we could get ads in the Melody Maker because they would put ads in the Melody Maker for us and things like that. So it was, as it were, it was a clear step up. You know, having a label, being on a label was an obvious step up. It was the step up so that we became a semi-pro operation. It was only later on that we became professional, and then we screwed it all up.
Well, we're going to come back to that in a bit. But, you know, there you are. Crikey, you've taken them up, your first band that you've managed, and you've catapulted them, or helped them catapult from underground band to super happening band.
It was super happening in our heads, and amongst the 200 or 300 people that we knew, it was a super happening band. In terms of, you know, in Scunthorpe, they had not heard of the Pink Floyd unless they had got their copy of the Melody Maker had come in the post to them, you know. But we were building a sort of a business so that we, you know, because someone had to give us some money to buy the food and things and pay the rent and so on. And so, you know, there was a need for for sort of fun. But I had a house, or half a house, and Andrew had the Andrew and Wendy had the Alexander Street, yes, in Alexander Street, which is now an incredibly posh street. And we had people down in the basement. We had a basement, and we had the ground floor, and then we had the first floor. So at some stage we had 3 floors of people doing things. Oh, and the top floor. So we had 4 floors of people doing things. So Barney Bubbles would end up having a place there. Other bands would come in because as the Floyd became successful, if you're a young band, what do you want to do? You want to find a manager and who do you want as a manager? Someone who manages bigger bands, you know. And somehow or another, I think we instinctively didn't just go into the standard big music business route. You know, the sort of Morrison was sort of had links into the wider music business, but we were sort of always somehow a bit outside as these sort of undergroundy people.
And one of the major underground events that happened around then, which you were involved with and Pink Floyd was involved with, was the 14-hour Technicolor Dream, a concert in the Great Hall of Alexandra Palace, that's up in North London, in April 1967. It was a fundraiser for International Times that was needing funds at that time, organised by Hoppy and Miles and co. And I think it's actually in one of Peter Whitehead's films, Tonight Let's All Make Love in London, which we featured recently. And I think for Pink Floyd, it was a significant show for lots of reasons, partly because it was the biggest show I think maybe you'd done at the time. And it also turned out to be the harbinger of trouble to come, which we'll come back to in a bit. But also, it sounded like you were all quite out of it. This is what you said when you were telling Jonathan Green about it back in the day. You said, "That really was a psychedelic experience. It was the most psychedelic experience I've ever had. At least half the audience was doing acid. I was doing acid." We'd had to take a long drive to get there from Holland, and I did the last bit of the drive in the van. We dropped in at home and dropped some acid, and by the time we got to Alexander Palace, the acid was beginning to kick in. It sounds like you were quite an immersive manager then. I mean, you're not only getting the band to the gig, getting the gear to the gig, but you're also doing acid with them.
I'm also doing acid, yes.
So, you know, it wasn't just managerial, official, economic gear humping stuff, it was more personal.
You needed to, I suppose in some senses, most good managers, you know, sort of have some sort of parallel existence with the band so they understand them. You know, it's a question of vary how far the one is the business and the other is the creative and so on. But before you had lots of big labels and A&R men coming round, and you know, it was all a bit more scrappy. So like the manager would be the A&R man in some ways, say, oh yeah, that's a good song. You know, it's very useful for a band to have someone who can say, I like that song more than that song, that version of it more than that version of it. It's always hard to do it for yourself. It's good to have someone from outside, you know. And so this is what A&R people do now. You know, it is a continuing thing, that sort of friendly or whatever. It's a sort of positive criticism and help to sort of get what you can see as that's a good song. Now, can we make it into a good record? And oh, now it's quite a good record. Can we make it a better record? What do we do with it? Now we've got to package it. You know, there's that whole learning thing as to what is the music business, which I think is, in a way now, is much more corporate. You know, we didn't really know what we were doing, but we were sort of feeling towards it. And I'm not claiming it was all Andrew and I. I mean, there were other people doing it as well. You know, there was Joe Boyd, obviously, and you know, the other people around who were also making these incipient, you know, these moves. You know, other sort of managers and other bands who were sort of finding out how do I take my sort of high school, my grammar school music into being a business? You know, how do I make money from playing my instrument, and how does that then build into a career? And you know, and then, oh, should I have a manager? Who should be the manager? Do I have a publisher? What's a publisher? What's a manager? There are all these things that you have to find out. And in some senses, you can read books about it, but in some senses, you can only find out by doing it. They come up to you. If you're a happening band, I mean, a lot of people would come up to us in the early days of the Floyd and would say, hello, let me introduce myself. You're the manager of the Pink Floyd, aren't you? I'd like to be your agent. I'd like to be your publisher. And you what's a publisher?
Right, so you're all working it out together, and it wasn't just, you, the manager, giving out instructions and paying for stuff. It was a bit more a family affair to an extent.
Yes, I mean, of course, there's a relationship with the band. There has to be if you're involved. And when you're dealing with someone like Roger Waters, you're not going to tell him, what to wear. You might try, but he's probably not going to take any notice. He thinks he knows his answers, and I think I know my answers. And in some senses, you there's a sort of blending of those things. And if you find you can't get on, then it disappears. You find a new manager, you find a new artist. You go back to getting a proper job. Certainly, I was, a big mate of Syd's, and I've told the story about Interstellar Overdrive, which, in a way, I think is a sort of how close it got. This was as close as it got. I was going over to see Syd. So I was walking across London, and I heard this music coming out of someone's house. I thought, that's interesting. And I sort of wandered over to Syd, and I heard this thing, and I said, I heard this song, and it went so, da, 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 and then, so I'd heard something which I'd misremembered, translated or mistranslated into my humming of it, which Syd then picked up and played on guitar, and that became Interstellar Overdrive. And that to me is a very interesting story of how creativity occurs. There's that sort of series of random events and non-random events. So what I heard coming out of someone's window, which was a little red book by Love.
And I'm assuming that they didn't give you any publishing credit on Interstellar Overdrive, though.
Of course not. I didn't know what a publishing credit was, probably.
Right, so let's talk about Syd Barrett and your relationship with him. I mean, he's a figure that's sort of always seems to be in the background in many of these stories for lots of different reasons. Obviously, immensely talented and immensely tragic. And this, I'm about to read something which June Childs, who worked for you, who became June Bolan, married Marc Bolan, wrote about it at the time, about that big gig at Alexander Palace, the 14 Technicolor Dream. And it's interesting because it seems to combine all that sort of stuff. Okay, you guys, were a bit out of it and stuff, but Syd was particularly out of it, which she's talking about. But also, it's quite interesting from the point of view of music management, because it brings in that whole thing about, having to get paid for the sake of the band. This was the last gig that Syd played with the Floyd. Massive, huge stage, huge auditorium packed. And she says, I think they may have got £1,000, I'm assuming. They were top of the bill. First of all, we couldn't find Syd. Then I found him in the dressing room, and he was so gone. I kept saying, Syd, it's June, it's me, look at me. Roger Waters and I got him on his feet. We got him out on the stage. He had a white Stratocaster. We put it around his neck, and he walked on stage. And of course, the audience went spare because they loved them. The band started to play, and Syd stood there. He had his guitar around his neck and his arms just hanging down. And I was in the wing, and Pete, Jenna, you, was on one side and Andrew was on the other. And we're looking at each other wondering what to do. And they did 3-4 numbers and we got him off. I had the money, which I always insisted on getting before we went on. And the readies were all in my bag. And Pete came across behind the stage and said, go and sit in the car. He could see what was going to happen. Syd couldn't even stand up for the set, let alone do anything else. I went to the car. Immediately, the promoter realised they weren't going to do a set, not because the rest of the band didn't want to, but Syd couldn't. The promoter wanted the chick with the money. Pete said, I'm awfully sorry. She's gone. She had to leave early.
Yes, well, absolutely. I mean, it's a sort of survivalism. You're in a place with all these people, and the band don't get paid, I don't get paid. And in some senses, it was a very important gig, and we'd driven all the way over from Holland to do the gig, so we needed to get paid. We didn't have a lot of money, so that we needed to get the money we were going to get, because otherwise people wouldn't get their wage. They're 15 quid a week, One does have to eat, and one does need some money in the pocket to buy a bit of dope or to whatever, or to get something to eat, so there is a sort of somewhere to live and so on,
And, witnessing Barrett at that show, and given the context of what was going on with him and with the band, it must have been actually very stressful. Apart from getting paid, I mean, there was so much happening, probably so much riding on it, that I imagine that, that kind of thing going wrong at that point, I mean, from a business career point of view for you and the band, must have been really quite tricky.
Oh, yeah. It's like, it was all happening. We were a happening band. We had a deal with EMI. We had a record coming out. We'd had a sort of, we're getting promo from EMI, and it was all looking good. We had an album coming together or being planned, and, all that stuff. I don't know quite what the sequential thing is, but, that, and it was a huge gig. It was all very sort of, and we all out of our heads, one way or another. On dope or acid or whatever,
And for him, that kind of drug use or whatever else was going on with him proved fairly catastrophic, didn't it? So I don't know where this was in the whole narrative of what happened, but he was going downhill. You were trying to help him, trying to save him, and weren't able to, really.
No, he went off and stayed with Storm and Poe. And had a room there. I think they were both Cambridge friends, so he felt safe with them. And so he was doing a lot too much acid. Then he ended up in some place in as far as I can, a place in Gloucester Road where there was a flat where he was staying and was getting acid every day and things, and it all sort of disintegrated.
Yeah, I mean, he disintegrated, didn't he? And of course, it's been well documented how, it got so difficult for the band. He became so unpredictable on stage and off that they got to the point where they just stopped picking him up, when they had a gig, and having not picked him up once, found it easier to play without him, and David Gilmour getting more involved and stuff, and sort of didn't think they needed the hassle anymore. Which was a kind of tragedy in itself. And of course, you and Andrew as Blackhill make the decision as the band splitting up that you're going to back Syd, who of course had been the star, the songwriter, the gorgeous, charismatic one in the band, the kind of elfin prince. And you let the rest of the band go their own way, right? But you did carry on with Syd despite his disintegrating condition, and to do stuff, didn't you?
Oh yeah, I would try and do records with Syd, and we'd try and get him to go, and it was all falling apart. It all fell apart, and I think it fell apart for everybody. It fell apart for Syd, and in some senses fell apart for Blackhill, but we put other things together. We had a structure, we had some people. We didn't have to be creative. We just had to make it work. We didn't have to write songs or, go and stand in front of people and sing. We were sitting in the background.
Completely aside from the kind of professional management thing, which must have been really worrying and disappointing for you both. What was it like personally? Because, I mean, obviously, you'd known him quite a long time by this time and seen, his rise and fall and how talented he'd been. Must have been quite upsetting to see him in such a state in the studio.
The sessions I did with Syd were just totally upsetting, because he was scrambled egg. He could sing a bit of a song and he'd do a line or two and play a bit of guitar, but putting the bits together started to get beyond him, which was a real shame, because he was a wonderful singer and guitar player and writer and everything. He was the band. I mean, the first album is Syd Barrett's album.
But subsequent albums weren't. The Pink Floyd went off, you stuck with Syd, the band went off with new management and stuff, and in the intervening years, as they rose to become, one of the biggest rock bands in the world with all the money that involved, did you ever have any senses of regrets, or did you just like buckle down and get on with the next thing?
No, I think we went on doing other things that came along, and there were other people we looked after and so on. In some senses, we were, in some senses, to be the original manager of Pink Floyd was always an asset, even if we weren't the managers anymore. And people came to Black Hill to be managed and to find a career. And these are the guys who discovered the Pink Floyd. So we were. That still is. Why are you talking to me now? Talking to me now because I was the first manager of the Pink Floyd. Who are you going off to see today? I got to see Pete Jenner. Who's he? Oh, he was the guy who was one of the original managers of the Pink Floyd. That's who I am.
That's true, but you did also go on to be heavily involved in the careers of Marc Bolan, The Clash, Roy Harper, Billy Bragg, Ian Drury. There's quite a lot more happened afterwards.
Absolutely, but it was the key. Without the Floyd, all the others wouldn't have happened for us. Same for anyone, isn't it? For a writer, someone asks you to write a piece on something, you do it and it's good. Then somebody else will ask you to do, or that person will ask you to do another piece, or somebody else will ask you to do a piece. What you do leads to what you get asked to do.
Exactly. But the past is the past. But do you ever run into those guys from Pink Floyd anymore? And if you do, what's it like?
Oh, every now and then one comes across them, or I go to. If they're doing a gig, I can always phone up and say, "Can I come?" And they'll say yes. And I think the one who I've had who's easiest for me to talk with is probably is Nick. Roger is fine. I think that if you went and interviewed Roger, he would probably have some quite nice things to say about me, as well as some less nice things. And the same with, I think Dave Gilmour would have more nice things to say about me and less nasty things to say. And I think Nick would be, on the whole, Nick has always been the friendliest and he's the most amiable.
But your life moved on from Pink Floyd, and as we said, you managed lots of other people. And also the counterculture moved on, didn't it? 60s turned into 70s, and things got a bit darker, started to evolve a bit. And for you guys, I guess it was a different era.
It was shifting, and what we did change, and the music business was changing, and what we did changed, and our perception of what we could do. But we went on and looked at other things, and I don't do very much now, but I still do things. Some people are still foolish enough to come and see me. What's a great thing is it's like having children. And I don't mean this in a patronizing way. That thing, they grow up. Your artists, when you start working with an artist, you're really useful to them. And then you can go on being useful and structure's gone, but you become less and less necessary. You grow up. When you're a kid, you need someone to go out and buy your food for you. When you grow up, the next thing you want is to have some money so you can buy your own food. And then the next thing, can you give me some money so I can get, then the next thing is that you build something whereby, you make the money which buys your food. And it's the same with artists. I think that, that relationship with a manager has that sort of long-term effect, And if you think about even people like Brian Epstein, they sort of disappear, don't they? The managers disappear. Lou Goldham. You, as a manager, you have a function which is really beneficial and useful and important. And as time goes by, it becomes less important because there are other people who come in and do the bits, or, the band become more efficient, or they get roadies, or they get an agent and an agent in America, and they like working in America rather than, so it shifts, time shifts, things change with time. When you're designing a new car, you don't want someone who designed the first car. You want someone who's designed a car last month. You don't want, a sort of 1940s car, which, runs out, which sort of, still sort of works, but goes bang quite a lot and things like that. I
don't quite see you as somebody like a 1940s car or driving a 1940s car. I see you maybe in the 60s driving a Carman Ghia or, I don't know, maybe a Hillman Imp. But yeah, Carman Ghia.
No, no, no. I mean, I might have wished I had a Carman Ghia. I might have fantasized about having a Carman Ghia. I mean, I'm a banger Citroen now. You know, I'm an old geezer. I mean, I'm 77. You know, what the fuck are the kids doing? I don't know.
You need to get a Tesla. Get with it. Get a Tesla.
I can't afford a fucking Tesla. Give me a break. No one's in my working with me is earning enough money to buy me a Tesla. I mean, because that's the other thing. The artists have to earn the money for me to make money. You know, I mean, the promoter puts on a gig, and then he pays some of the money to the artist, and then the artist pays some of the money to the manager and the agent. What are my advantages? I've got experience and I've got a historical knowledge. What's my disadvantages? I don't know what my main disadvantage. I don't know what the fuck's happening at the moment. I don't listen to the radio. I don't listen to records. I don't know what's happening. I don't look at the NME. You know, I'm out of touch. Does that matter? I don't think so, really, particularly. I'm out of touch because I don't particularly care about being in touch. I don't care. I'm not interested in deeply, but someone may come in and may tickle my fancy. They may come in and, oh, they're interesting. I might end up managing somebody again next year who becomes huge. They might be intrigued by what I know and what I've done, and they might be able to extract from me my knowledge and use it to develop their careers. Join them in it, and I may be part of it, and I may better make some money off of them. And I may enable them to make some money for themselves.
Quite right too. So, well, listen, we're coming to the end here. Before we finish, I wanted to circle back to those heady days of the 60s and 70s, because the other thing which you haven't mentioned is that you were instrumental in kicking off that tradition of concerts outside in Hyde Park, which had become massive. It's become, until COVID anyway, had become part of the annual calendar. I imagine a huge money-making thing for Hyde Park. But when you started it off, it was your idea, wasn't it? And started off with the Floyd and various other bands that you were involved with at the time. And then, of course, the Stones doing that huge show. So tell us how that all came about.
In a way, it's a nice story because it includes my dear late wife. We were out for a walk, and I think we had my young son in the pram, and we were walking in Hyde Park. Went for a walk in Hyde Park, and there was a bandstand. I was like, oh, that's interesting. There's a bandstand. So that was really the first kickoff. Oh, look, there is a bandstand in Hyde Park. So music in Hyde Park exists. Now that bandstand was an old-fashioned bandstand, and there were, maybe 40 deck chairs around it, and they were playing the brass bands. I'd also read and heard about the fact they did these concerts in California, open air concerts, because they have better weather than we do. And so those two things coincided, and I thought, oh, why don't we do a concert in Hyde Park for some of our bands? That'd be a nice place for them to do. So I found out, who do I get in touch with? And I got in touch with the person who has to okay it is Jenny Lee. She was the minister who was going to decide whether we could do something in the park. And I then discovered or realized that Jenny Lee had been my grandfather's girlfriend. And, he died by then. He died. I wrote to Jenny Lee in her ministerial capacity and said, here's someone who was her old boyfriend's grandson putting on let's give it a chance. So she gave it the okay, and then everybody let it happen because no one had done it. It would seem like, we do concerts in the park. Why shouldn't we do a different sort of concert in the park? And then that's how the concerts in Hyde Park started, and they became huge. And then, of course, they reached their natural peak, and then they sort of went into decline and became this sort of awful Branson version where you all sit in chairs and you pay for your ticket, and it's just another gig, it's another concert. the great thing about the Hyde Park concerts was that they were different. They were a thing you could go to on a Saturday or Sunday afternoon. You could go along, and there was someone playing music. Great. I could just sit down and eat my sandwich.
It was quite anarchic then, part of the whole underground thing.
Oh, yes. Absolutely. There were never... I don't know if we ever had... We did have sort of... By the time we were doing the Stones in Hyde Park, we had to have some sort of backstage parties and things, but it wasn't until they got really big. It started off with being a smaller thing, you know, and smaller stages and things, and then it was Blind Faith, and then it was the Rolling Stones. People were sort of climbed up into the trees and sat in the trees and watched it, you know, and they brought their picnics.
Didn't sound like you made any money then.
Oh, we didn't make any money, absolutely. Or we made, because, you know, there were TV rights, we didn't get paid on those, you know. I'm a terrible businessman in many ways. I'm a good creative, creative manager. I'm not a good businessman. Look at the state of my office now, you know. I'm clearly not a great businessman. Think of all the stuff I've done, and I haven't got anything to show for it in a way. I've got a bit to show for it. I've got my memories, and I'm still alive, and I've got my kids, and I've got my grandchildren, and you know, I'm not. It's not a tragic tale. But, you know, considering what I've done, I've really made remarkably little money. I'm a terrible businessman.
Yeah, but come on. I mean, you've made an impact, haven't you? I mean, you made a countercultural impact, obviously with the Pink Floyd, but also all those other bands we talked about. And, you know, the Free School, and IT, and all those initiatives you're involved with. I mean, the Hyde Park thing, I mean, you know, those concerts outside, all that stuff. I mean, you know, Glastonbury, the festivals probably came from that. And, you know, that stuff that you guys were up to in the 60s and as it turned into the 70s, a lot of the political movements that emerged from that time, you know, had that roots in that early countercultural stuff, right? How does it feel looking back on it now?
I think I have helped. I certainly had some impact in changing Britain a little bit, and then some impact on the sort of music that gets played and the way it's worked. And I think you should always respect your roots. You know, that I respect sort of what Brian Morrison did for me. I respect what the Floyd did. And I think the Floyd respect what I did. You know, I'm sure, you know, if you ask Roger what he thinks about me, he'd have mixed views. Some aspects of what I've done, he probably really detests, and some things he would think, well, if it wasn't for him, it wouldn't have happened.
There we have it. If it wasn't for him, it wouldn't have happened. Thank you very much, Pete. And thanks for listening. We got to the end, rushed to the end there. Having had a few managers myself, I've got to say it's an unenviable job. I mean, if you're going to work in the music industry, why would you be a music manager? I mean, the only thing more tough, I think, is being a tour manager, you know, where you've got to take care of a lot of adults who revert to being adolescents. Anyway, there we go. It was a fascinating time with Pete. Thanks again to him, to Mushi as well, who set it up. We appreciate that. Hope you enjoyed it. You can hear more stories from the Counterculture, of course, by going to www.bureauoflostculture.com. I was Stephen Coates. See you next time.